Welcome everybody to another tutorial, and today I'm going to show you how to use manual exposure in wildlife photography. So with manual exposure, we are going to take control of all the settings on the camera. We're not going to leave anything up to the camera. We're going to do it ourselves. So by doing that, we can have complete control over how the picture looks. So we can change the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO to give the effects that we want to the image, and to some extent we can control the noise levels as well. So I'm going to put my camera onto manual exposure, which I think is pretty much the same on every camera. Very simple. It's just going to be M for manual. Just to mention as well that sometimes people can get a little confused when I talk about manual and they think maybe it relates to the focus. So this has got nothing to do with the focus. We're just talking about how the camera exposes the image. Nothing to do with the focus. If you want to change that, then you need to go onto the lens, sometimes on the camera, and select manual focus. I'm going to briefly mention what each thing does. I'm not going to go into it in depth. I can do that in other videos. Firstly, you've got the shutter speed. So this is just basically the shutter opens for a certain amount of time and then closes to let in a certain amount of light, like a duck's beak, I guess. It also affects motion, whether you get blurred or sharp images. The second thing is your aperture. Just think of it as a hole in the lens. It opens to let in more light, it closes to let in less light. Also affects your depth of field. Maybe that's like the duck. And then thirdly, you've got the ISO. Now, in a way, it is kind of to do with sensitivity of light, but I just would think of it as an amplification. Really, it's just making the picture darker or lighter in the camera. That's how I think of it. So if you're making the picture lighter, you're kind of amplifying the signal to do that, but it will introduce noise in your picture, which essentially looks like grain. Now, with manual exposure, one of the most important things is the exposure meter. So you need to get used to looking at the exposure meter and reading it and understanding what it's telling you. Now, on most cameras, you'll probably find this either on the back or through the viewfinder. In the viewfinder, you'll probably find it's at the bottom or maybe down the side. So your job is to manipulate all three things, the shutter speed, the aperture and the ISO, manipulate all three in a combination to get that exposure meter around the middle. Now, occasionally it's not going to be exactly in the middle. We'll come to that later in the video. I'm going to assume that you're using evaluative metering, because I know a lot of people use this. It might be called matrix metering, maybe multi-metering. So this is the exposure mode where it basically takes everything into account in the viewfinder and kind of averages it out to give you the correct exposure. I know some people might use spot metering on occasion, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume that you're using evaluative metering. I was going to do like this whole woodland shoot thing to show you manual exposure, but I think we can find some wildlife. So I'm down at the local park now, and I'm just looking at this rather attractive female mallard, which I'm going to photograph. And what I'm going to do is actually change all three settings, so you can see that in practice. I'm going to change all three settings for what I want, so you can see exactly how the exposure's working on manual. So I've just switched my camera on again now, manual exposure, and you can see the settings that just happen to be there. You can see it's really underexposed. You can see the exposure is way under at the moment. Now I want a fairly wide aperture because I want to blur the background, so I'm going to go for an aperture of f5.6, and as we change that, you can see it's actually getting brighter. Closer to the middle now on the exposure meter. Now I'm going to go for a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, because I just want to stop any movement, particularly if the bird's moving, maybe preening. I think that's probably fast enough. So we're going to go to 1/250th, and you can see by doing that, by letting in less light, we've underexposed again. So I've got those two settings as I want them, shutter speed and aperture. I don't really want to change those. So the only other thing I can change to get the exposure back in the middle is the ISO. So we're going to go to the ISO and we're going to put this up. I'm going to guess about 500. Oh, look at that, bang on in the middle there. So now we've got the exposure meter. It might float around slightly because the light levels are now changing. Back off a bit. There we've got the exposure meter in the middle on those settings. Okay, another example, this time with one of my least favourite creatures, the grey squirrel. Anyway, we're here to do manual exposure. Let's have a look at the moment. Again, the exposure meter there is underneath. We want to get it around the middle. So I'm thinking, what do we say? I'm going to say 125th of a second. Let's say we're just going to try and go for a simple portrait when the squirrel sits up. There isn't too much movement. So we're very underexposed at the moment. Aperture wise, now on this lens, this is actually the widest aperture, f5.6. f5.6 is as wide as it will go, and you can see it's still very, very underexposed there on the exposure meter. So again, the only thing we can do is to increase the ISO to brighten it up. So I'm going to go up here to 500, and it's just slightly under, a little bit more, 640, and now I've got the exposure meter pretty much bang in the middle. Again, it's just slightly moving as the light changes. As you can see, where you get light changing like this, the meter is just constantly changing. This is quite good actually. At the moment, the sun is just coming in and going out, and you can see this exposure meter is just changing all the time. So this is the thing with manual exposure. When this happens, when the light changes, you've got to do something. You can't leave it to the camera. So if it's underexposes, nuthatch. If it underexposes, then I've got to make it brighter. If the sun comes out and it gets brighter, then I've got to go darker. So what about the advantages and disadvantages of manual exposure? Well, the big advantage really is that you can just take complete control of how you want your image to look. You can change all three settings to get the picture to look exactly as you want it to. Now the downside of that, the disadvantage is with wildlife photography, there simply just isn't enough time to do that. Sometimes things moving quickly, you don't have enough time to change those manual settings, and it's not just the physically changing them, it's actually thinking about them in your head as to what you need to change to get the effect you're after. Now having said that, another option is to use manual exposure but to use it with auto ISO. This can be really good option, probably a good one for a lot of people. So here what we're going to do, we're going to select the aperture and the shutter speed, because they're the ones that give us more control over how the picture looks. The ISO doesn't really do that. It doesn't affect the background, it doesn't affect motion, it doesn't really affect anything. It just affects how much noise is in your picture. So the important ones, aperture and shutter speed, we're going to choose for our liking. We're going to lock those in, and then with auto ISO, if the light does change, the subject moves from one place to another, then the ISO is going to change to alter the exposure. So it's a really good option. Now I should probably try and use this more of the time than I already do. I would say it works really well for the majority of the day. The only problem I find is if you're shooting very close to sunrise or sunset, as I often am, and shooting in the mist whenever possible, you can get such a extreme range of light and dark kind of at either end of the exposure that I actually find it works better to use aperture priority and auto ISO. I put a video up here to something in relation to that, but in those conditions I prefer aperture priority with automatic ISO. Done. Now we talked earlier about getting the exposure meter in the middle for the correct exposure, but there are situations where you might need to tweak it a little bit. So you might need to just tweak it slightly to the left or to the right of the middle. Now to do this, because we're on manual exposure, you probably won't be able to do it with exposure compensation, certainly not on some cameras. So what you're going to do is simply change one of the three things we talked about. So whether it's your shutter speed or your aperture or your ISO, you're going to change one of those just to tweak the exposure a little bit. And it's up to you whichever one you change for your purpose, or maybe you want to pick two things which you change in combination as well to give the same effect. So for example, if I was photographing a swan and I wanted to make sure I got detail in the white feathers, then I might need to underexpose a little bit. And the simplest way of doing that probably would be to increase the shutter speed, to make it faster, to let in less light, to give you a better exposure. really, manual exposure, it's not that complicated. It's just a case of manipulating all three things in a combination to give you the settings that you need for what you're after. And do drop me a line in the comments box below. Let me know, do you use manual exposure? Do you hate manual exposure? What do you think? When do you think it's appropriate? When do you think it's not appropriate? I do appreciate all the comments, and not just helping me as well, but helping each other. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.